What up, everybody? Here is a short video on evolution. So evolution is gradual changes in inherited characteristics. They need to be genetic characteristics, but genetic characteristics can change, as we're about to investigate and look at. So the mechanism of natural selection is how evolution is kind of powered. It's what drives the slow and gradual changes of living things on Earth. So how does natural selection work? Well, natural selection is based on the fact that organisms are not all identical. There's variation within a population from random mutations and meiosis, and that those variations can be inherited. Now, when you combine that with the fact that most populations produce more offspring than you could actually have survive, it would exceed the carrying capacity, and some environmental changes that sort of stress organisms and put selection pressures on them, you get a struggle to survive, which means that not all the organisms are going to survive. And if not all of them survive, then only the strongest survive, so to speak. So that creates a position where traits that are bad will basically cause organisms to struggle and most likely to die. They will not reproduce, they will not pass on their genes, and that population and that gene will gradually go away. Whereas an advantageous gene will likely help its organism survive, it will reproduce, it will pass on that gene, and then that gene will become more frequent. Gene by gene, organism by organism, this creates natural selection. The population should evolve to become adapted to their environment. Antibiotic resistance is an example of this, as is camouflage. So some examples of when things are evolving: a new trait caused by genetic mutation, changes in allele frequency, or basically when one phenotype becomes more prevalent than another. We'll talk about the peppered moths with that a little bit later. Selective breeding, adaptive radiation, which is where an ancestral species diversifies into multiple new forms. This is the case with Darwin's finches. Because of the different food resources on different islands in the Galapagos, a single population of ancestral finches diverged into many different kinds of finch, which could be argued as different species, and is a great example of adaptive radiation. And then also just the slow genetic drift, the slow but steady mutation of organisms gradually changing over very long periods of time. Is there evidence for evolution? Heck yes, there is. Tons of it. Why would we believe in it if there wasn't any evolution? Fossils show physical forms and transitions across rock layers. You can estimate ages based on the layers of rock and carbon dating. Comparative genetics is a big one because when two DNA sequences are very close to each other, that would indicate that those two organisms are probably very closely related and didn't separate that long ago. We call those separations speciations, or that they speciated. So mutations happen at consistent rates, and by looking at the number of differences between two organisms' genetic codes, you could actually estimate how long ago they separated. How cool is that? Selective breeding, that's a little bit more artificial, but it still counts as evolution because it's a proof of the concept of how quickly and dramatically forms can change just based on whether or not you survive and whether or not you reproduce. And lastly, homologous and analogous structures. Homologous structures are similar because of common ancestry. A lot of vertebrates have the exact same bone plan in their arms. It's called the pentadactyl limb. And also other kind of weird cases like whales having hip bones because they descended from land animals. That would be a homologous structure with other hips, even though those hips are small, puny, and kind of on their way out. Analogous structures are an example of convergent evolution, where two separate things become similar looking because they have a similar function. So examples include the wings of bats, reptiles, and birds, and even insects, because these wings evolved completely independently of one another. They are not evolutionarily linked by anything other than the pentadactyl limb. But that limb changed and took on new forms many different times in history, producing the bat wing, the reptile wing, and the bird wing. They are, if you look closer at them, not all that similar in the way that they evolved, other than the fact that they all took on this sort of flapping wing shape. Which brings us to speciation, which is essentially when a population evolves, when it separates into two species from one previous species. And these happen because of gene pool barriers. Basically, a group becomes reproductively isolated for some reason. That reproductive isolation could be because of geographic isolation, where there's physically a barrier. Two groups of squirrels were isolated by the onset of the Grand Canyon, and now they have changed a little bit from each other and could be considered their own species. Temporal isolation is time isolation. For instance, flower organ maturity or hibernation and migration times. If you're not able to reproduce because you're not around at the same times, that would be a barrier to reproduction. Behavioral isolation. Sometimes there are very specific behaviors that need to be shown or very specific patterns of color, and that's not a behavior, but sometimes reproduction is a very, very specific and tricky game. And so having the right behaviors can be very important for that, and you might isolate yourself with a reproductive group if you are not performing the right behaviors. And then lastly, and perhaps most dramatically, polyploidy. This refers to like haploid, diploid, triploid, octoploid. It's the number of chromosomes you have. And so if you just by accident get an extra set of chromosomes, you are probably genetically incompatible with your other group. And this is pretty rare, but if it does happen in the right circumstances, it can lead to punctuated equilibrium, and you have an instant new species. This happened with frogs at least once that scientists know about, where the frogs just got an extra set of chromosomes. They went from diploid to triploid. They could not reproduce with the other members of their group, and now they are totally reproductively isolated and are slowly changing into their own species. A great example of evolution is the peppered moths, an example of industrial melanism. There are these two kinds of pepper moths, the white phenotype and the black phenotype, shown here against different kinds of wood or trees. Here the white lichens very clearly show camouflage for the white moth, and here the black moth is a little bit more camouflaged because of the darker bark. And so basically the Industrial Revolution happened in England, and it changed the environment. The environment went from being one of a lot of white lichens on trees to sooty, black, and dead lichens. And suddenly, what used to be a good trait, being white, meant you camouflaged in, now meant you stuck out. And what used to be a bad trait, being darker, means that you blend in now. And so predation took over, and natural selection took over, and basically the two populations flipped. There used to be not very many dark moths, and then the populations flipped, and dark moths kind of had their heyday there for a little while, at least until pollution measures took over and they stopped punching so much carbon and pollution into the atmosphere. Lastly, but not leastly, we get to the idea of these trees, or what we would call a cladogram. So a clade is any group of organisms that descend from a common ancestor. So here's a clade, but here's another clade, just a smaller one. As long as you have the common ancestor and all descendants, that is a clade. And so cladograms show the probable sequence of speciation and divergence. You have speciation events, and then their lineages that result. And so here you'll notice that once you get a trait like a vertebrate spine or a skeleton or 4 limbs or an amniotic egg, all of the descendants have that trait. Generally in evolution you gain traits, not so often do you lose them. So by putting all this together, genetic analysis, fossils, transition species, homologous and analogous structures, and a whole lot more, we have been able to slowly put together a tree of life, ancestor by ancestor, species by species, branch by branch, into what we would call the theory of evolution, which ultimately predicts that if you go back far enough, all life, including all eukaryotes and even prokaryotes, are descendant from a single common ancestor.